Hey everyone, Jody Avergan here. On Sundays over the course of the summer, July and August, we're going to be bringing you some of our favorite episodes from the archives. You're still going to get brand new episodes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but we're giving ourselves a little bit of a break on Sundays, running a previous episode. It's still from around the same date, so it will still hook in that way. But look, we've done about 450 of these. There's a good chance you haven't heard this one or haven't heard it in a while and might want to re-listen. So here we go with the Sunday favorite from the archives. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, July 22nd, 1975, the House votes to restore U.S. citizenship to Robert E. Lee, who commanded Confederate troops during the Civil War. I don't want to do much more in this intro because I think this simple fact, Robert E. Lee had his citizenship restored, opens up a lot of natural questions like, why did Robert E. Lee not have citizenship? Or why were they restoring it in 1975? And all of those, as you would expect, have very fascinating answers, or at least I think so. We'll leave you to judge that. You tell us at the end of the episode, did you think those were fascinating answers? Here to provide those answers are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is John Reeves, author of a number of books, including The Lost Indictment of Robert E. Lee, The Forgotten Case Against an American Icon. John, title alone, we know you're the man for this conversation, so thank you for coming.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And the book goes well beyond the title. It has an entire chapter on this 1975 vote. But, you know, I will say, this does bring up all sorts of interesting themes like the legend of Lee and lost cause mythology and this kind of whole twisty-turny national treasure-esque story about some long-lost documents. It's really fascinating. Do you want to start, John, though, with this simple question of why did Robert E. Lee not have citizenship?
Yeah, and maybe start first with the resolution itself, because the premise of the resolution is sort of funny and kind of bizarre, too. It's premised on the notion of the missing oath theory, and apparently an archivist at the National Archives found, supposedly, Robert A. Lee's oath that was supposed to go with his pardon application back in 1865. And so Congress led, the instigator of all of this was Senator Harry Byrd from Virginia. But in Congress, it was being led by another Virginian, M. Culver Butler. And essentially, they were saying that, hey, we found this missing oath, therefore, Lee should have been pardoned back there in June 1865. So let's do it. And it made its way slowly to Congress, but the resolution was voted on in July of 1975, and it passed overwhelmingly 407 to 10. Now, I said the premise is a bit bizarre because that oath actually never did go missing. It was always in the custody of the United States government. And John Conyers, Representative Conyers, kept bringing that inconvenient fact up during the debate. And everyone just wanted to kind of move on because stop ruining our moment to pardon Robert.
He's like, by the way.
Yeah. He actually said,
like this was on display.
Yeah. But just to clarify, when we say this oath of Lee's, what are we referring to?
Oh, yes. So in June of 1865, President Andrew Johnson said that certain classes of Confederate leaders would have to apply directly for a pardon to him. And you needed to fill out a pardon application, number one, but you also had to include an oath to the Constitution, a loyalty oath. Now, Lee, and there's an important point here, but Lee did fill out his pardon application, but in fairness to him, he may not have known about that an oath needed to be included with the pardon application. And then he subsequently took the oath on October 2nd, 1865. So there was a gap of several months between when he filed the pardon in June of 1865 and when he took the oath. And so according to the lost oath theory, if Andrew Johnson had only known about that oath, he would have pardoned him. But the reality was Lee was under indictment for treason in 1865. Andrew Johnson wasn't going to pardon him. In fact, Johnson was going around saying treason must be made odious. And one of the ironies about Andrew Johnson is, in many ways, a terrible president. And he was racist and a white supremacist. But he was the one who wanted to punish the Confederate leadership. So sometimes history is confusing, right? Because you would assume that Andrew Johnson would maybe be sympathetic to the Jefferson Davises and the Robert E. Lees, but he wasn't. And he felt that the leadership needed to be punished. But Johnson was in favor of sort of wholesale pardons for the rank and file, because he felt like, most of these people were kind of coerced into following the Confederacy by the leadership. And so that's where, my point being is, Andrew Johnson had no intention of pardoning Robert E. Lee in 1865. Now, he did eventually pardon those Confederates who had been indicted in a general pardon in December 1868. So Johnson was going out the door. He didn't run for re-election. And he was like, let's close the books on this, so to speak. And he pardoned all of the remaining Confederates who had been. So in 1868, Robert E. Lee was pardoned for all intents and purposes. Now, under the 14th Amendment, there was one remaining disability under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which meant Robert E. Lee couldn't hold federal office. Now, that was struck down in 1898, but Lee had been deceased, right? So these Congress people in 1975 were saying, well, this disability out there still exists for Robert E. Lee, so we need to take care of that so he can have complete citizenship restored. So, and once again, Congress kept saying, let me get this straight. So we want to give him the right to hold office? And he's kind of having fun with it, right? And all the others are yes. So,
they're like, yes, actually, we will dig him up. Virginia will vote for him.
Yeah, I know, actually.
That's crazy. Nobody's like, he's dead. Yeah. Oh my God. Like, that. All of this is so absurd to me, because it just shows the allegiance and the length that people will go to recover these narratives, or I should even say curate or create these narratives that perpetuate ideas about the lost cause and about Robert E. Lee and about certain positions that I think Robert E. Lee himself had a distaste for. So, all of this is just so remarkable to me, but yet it keeps happening, and decades after his death.
Well, one interesting thing to that point is, one of the congressmen, M. Caldwell Butler, gave a little speech, right? And he quoted a constituent who said, if Robert E. Lee is unworthy of citizenship, who is? If he can't be a citizen, who can be?
Almost everyone.
I was going to say there's a really long list. It's about 300 million people.
He literally fought to end the republic, and yet he is the highest level of citizen according to the Virginia delegation. It's crazy.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
There's an important story here, which is that immediately after the war, right, there had been this ongoing treason. Obviously, it had been this long, bloody war, and there was a desire to make there be consequences, right? There had to be some sort of consequence for what people had done. And what you see in the story of Lee is how those consequences, which probably weren't even severe enough at first, just get ratcheted back and ratcheted back and ratcheted back, and then suddenly he's a hero and he's part of this mythology. And so it's two things, right? It's the creation of a mythology, but it is also the dwindling or retraction of consequences when people were still alive, which I'm not going to talk about the present, but I think there are resonances.
Yeah, I think the fact that Robert E. Lee can become a college president of Washington College, no less, says a lot about where the country's values were and how it's very difficult for people to sort of fall from grace. I mean, and not recover in meaningful ways. I mean, Robert E. Lee, for all intents and purposes, did not live a life of poverty and go off to be like, some person who was imprisoned or incarcerated the rest of his life. He still has a career ahead of him. And even after he dies, he still has, I can't even call it like infamy, like fame among his believers, like these people who hold him up to such a standard that he would be right up there with George Washington himself.
Yeah, I think that military lineage is really important because, he gets cleaned up in American history more broadly, but within the military, he becomes this kind of venerated general, which is one of the reasons that Eisenhower, when he's president, is on the Robert E. Lee bandwagon, because he's like, but he was such a great general, and who knows good generals better than Dwight Eisenhower?
I think that, I agree with both of what you said, that over a course of 100 plus years, right, from when Lee dies in 1870 till this vote in 1975, he has risen to the heights of, this mythical figure. Because I think right after the war, there were many Americans who felt, well, look, this guy's a traitor, and he supported slavery and fought for slavery. So it's still a lot of Americans who had a negative view post-Civil War. But by 1975, at least in Congress, this unanimous support in the Senate for his restored citizenship, and then the vote of 407 to 10 in the House. So it's almost pretty much unanimous. And then I'm really thinking about nowadays, right? Think of what's changed, though, since 1975. I mean, even in our Congress today, he wouldn't be getting those sort of numbers of support, right? So it'd probably be flipped, or at least the supporters of Lee in both the Senate and the House it would be an uncomfortable vote for many of them, right? So we've come a long way in just the last few decades.
Well, I would argue, though, maybe it's even, maybe up until like 2010 or 15, maybe I could even see something like this happen. It's really only in the last few years that some of these real questions have started to get asked. We've talked about it a little bit, but I do want to linger on this idea of the myth of Robert E. Lee and this sort of, almost a secular saint. And I think for people who maybe didn't grow up in the South or haven't spent time in the South or haven't spent time in sort of military communities, it's really hard to paint a picture of how much Lee there's a great book out now by this man named Ty Sedgwill, who's sort of called Robert E. Lee and Me, and he talks about how growing up in the South, there's just this myth of Lee that just imbues everything. Schools are named after him. There's monuments. If you're in the military, there's bases and universities and so forth. And he describes just having this moment very late in his life where he just sort of looks up and says, wait a minute, what's going on here? Including, for instance, when there was a push to have MLK Day and Martin Luther King Day, a number of states, including Virginia, said, okay, well, we'll give MLK Day, but we'll call it Lee Jackson King Day. And for a number of years in a lot of states in the South, there were bundled holidays to celebrate Robert E. Lee and Martin Luther King on the same day. And, so I don't know, John, can you just paint a little bit of that picture of that sort of just like deeply imbued Lee mythos?
Oh, yes, of course. So, several people that were close to Lee after his death really went about creating this myth, not only around Lee, but part of this whole lost cause interpretation of the Civil War that we're familiar with, right? That the war wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. And that the South would have won if only we had as many men as the North and as many resources, and that it was a noble cause and we lost, but it's only because we were undermanned, and that Lee was the finest general of the Civil War. And so there's this myth that's got created, and then just to kind of, summarize, it really took hold first across the South after Lee's death in 1870, but then it was sort of embraced by the North too. Once again, as a way of putting the unpleasantness of the Civil War behind us, we could all unite around this lost cause idea that, hey, both sides were good people just doing what they thought was best. And then the Lee piece is very important, right? Because one of the biggest myths about him is that, oh, he was opposed to slavery and he didn't like it and he wanted to free all the slaves. But the reality of it was that he managed 200 slaves from his father-in-law's estate. His father-in-law passed away and Lee became the executor. And while the Civil War was going on, Lee was actually pursuing a legal case to keep those slaves under his control because his father-in-law had wanted to emancipate them after 5 years, according to the will. But Lee wanted to kind of keep them working in order to pay off some debts and some legacies associated with the will. My point here is that Lee was someone who benefited from slavery, and this rhetoric that he was somehow opposed to it is not supported by the evidence. And then fast forward to 1975, during that entire congressional discussion, slavery wasn't even mentioned once, right? So I think it's interesting that they're debating whether to restore citizenship, but his fighting to uphold a Confederate state that is based on slavery is never part of the debate. It shows you how influential the Lost Cause was, right? By 1975, it had become orthodoxy for almost all Americans, I think.
Yeah. Oh, well, David Blight talks about this in his books as well, but it's so much about the post-Civil War movement is about reuniting a white North and a white South. The Black community or Black people are completely left out of that conversation, completely left out of that narrative. And so you would almost think that it would be difficult to figure out what the war was about. Like when you think of it in terms of like restoring whiteness and sort of the brother against brother narrative, all of the elements of slavery and white supremacy is just completely pushed to the bottom, if not completely taken off the table, so that no one's even reckoning with this elephant in the room when you think about who these people are.
Yeah, it's almost not the elephant in the room; it is the room, right? Like, it's astounding. And then you get to the 1970s, and the 1970s is a really interesting moment for this to be happening because there is a kind of nationwide Confederate revival. If you go to Boston in the 1970s to the anti-busing protests, you see Confederate flags waving. In 1979, the Dukes of Hazzards come out, and you have this kind of embrace of Confederate symbols and sort of yeehaw lifestyle. And so I think that there's something really interesting going on in addition to the centennial in the 1970s that is supporting this not just in the South, but across the white culture in the U.S.
Oh, and I'll just make one more related point, and that is that in order to deify Lee, that connection with slavery had to be erased, right? Because it's such an odious legacy for him that they have to erase it. And so I think one of the things that is interesting that has come out in recent years is that there was a story in the 1860s that was well known that Lee had several of his slaves brutally whipped because they had tried to escape from Arlington, and they were caught. And the name of the one slave who wrote up an affidavit about this was named Wesley Norris. And that Wesley Norris story, once again, it was known in the 1860s, but it's kind of come back, right? People are more aware of it. And when you see Lee yelling at his overseer to lay it on hard to his slaves, it makes you think of him differently than this noble knight that needs to have his citizenship restored, you know?
Yeah.
Well, what you're saying, you know, in a lot of our conversation feels like it gets at this larger question of, I feel like often when we talk about the past, we write off that norms were different or things were different or standards were different and behavior was different. And so we start to excuse, and we don't recognize that there actually was dissent all along the way. And there were people standing up and sort of taking a moral stance. And, you know, I think this description of, in the wake of the war, people actually trying to bury Lee and, you know, and write him out of history is so important. It's just such a good reminder that there are people along the way who are drawing lines in the sand. It's not just, oh, it was a different time. So as we start to wrap up, I want to add one little button on here, John, because this vote seemed to have caused a little bit of everyone caught restoring citizenship fever, I guess, because in 1978, they do the same thing for Jefferson Davis.
Yeah, and Jefferson Davis was a more combative character because, he never applied for a pardon and didn't want one. So in some ways, we were posthumously pardoning someone who didn't even want it, so that adds another dimension to it.
Yeah. Can I just read, there's a quote from Jefferson Davis that I think is so powerful. He says, "It had been said that I should apply to the United States for a pardon, but repentance must precede the right of a pardon, and I have not repented." And I'm like, wow. It doesn't get any more sort of emphatic than that. He's like, I said what I said. I did what I did. There's nothing else to add to that. It's sort of mind-blowing when you think about the audacity of a lot of these Confederate leaders who were like, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not repenting.
Yeah, it speaks to how strong the desire was to bring all of these Confederates back into the fold.
Yeah. The allegiance is insane.
Yeah, maybe I'll maybe make one last point, and that is, I mentioned that there was this real desire in 1975 for bipartisanship, right? Because we're coming off of Watergate, the Nixon resignation, but also the Vietnam War. And I mentioned that only 10 people voted against the resolution. And some of the critics had raised, hey, why don't we pardon the resistors to the Vietnam War before we pardon?
How'd that go over?
Yeah, it didn't. But I thought it was interesting that, this I really love Conyers' description. This bicentennial fluff was really this attempt to bridge a divide between Republicans and Democrats, or right and left, and that I just think it's interesting that the lost cause was the red to pull it all together.
All right. Well, also another moment where it's like, let's have bipartisanship, but on these very specific terms, which we see over and over again. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And John Reeves, thanks to you. So the book that you wrote about all of this was The Lost Indictment of Robert E. Lee, The Forgotten Case Against an American Icon. You have a new book, Fire in the Wilderness. You want to take a few seconds and talk about that?
Yeah, so the new book is about the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864. It's the first time Grant faced Lee on the battlefield. And it's really not just about military history, though. I talk a little bit about medicine and politics and the idea of memory. There's a lot of different threads in there. So it's a narrative, and it's about, I thought, a really important moment in American history.
What time of year did the Battle of the Wilderness happen? What were the dates?
Oh, yes. The battle was fought on May 5th and 6th, 1864.
So we just missed our hook for this
spring.
Next spring, we'll find a date, and let's have you back on and talk about the Battle of the Wilderness. Yeah, okay. John Reeves, thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.